So we are always interested in whether the policy does what it's supposed to do. But we should also really be concerned about if the policy does things beyond that. Maybe good things and maybe bad things. So here we're going to talk about some of the potential mechanisms by which the policy works. But we're also going to talk about consequences that have come about as a result of the policy that were not intended. So we're going to analyze 4 papers here, really in rapid succession, because I don't want to keep you here forever. First, does the EAP discourage CSU enrollment? That seems ominous. Does the EAP encourage math course taking in 12th grade? That seems better. How does the EAP impact high school accountability measures? What? And then, has there been an impact of the EAP on community colleges? That seems relevant, especially now. So first, we're going to focus on how does the EAP discourage CSU enrollment? Now, this seems like an odd question to ask because it's supposed to reduce the need for remediation, right? And it seems like it's kind of effective doing that. So why on earth would it discourage students from attending a CSU? But if you look at this, just focus on English for a minute. Over half the students who take this test in 11th grade are told they're not yet ready for CSU, for college level work. I was once an 11th grade student, and so that kind of amounts to some criticism. So there's 2 ways in which you could possibly take this. Actually, there's many ways, but there's 2 main ways. One, I could be motivated by the fact that I'm not yet ready for college, despite the fact that I have a 3.0. You saw that graph? I have a 3.0. I thought I'd be ready. It's a B average. But this paper says I'm not. So I could be motivated, and I could take better classes my senior year, maybe take that extra math class. I could get ready for college. Option 2 is I could receive that note that I'm not yet ready for college, and I could be discouraged from attending a CSU in the first place. Now, actually, weirdly enough, both of these would look like they reduce the need for remediation at the CSU, right? If more students are ready, that would work. But if more students who were going to need remediation didn't go to a CSU, that might also drop the need for remediation across the system. So we have to look at whether this is a possibility. So I'm interested in 2 things here: application to a CSU and enrollment at CSU. And again, this is using all the data that we got from the Chancellor's Office combined with the testing data from CDE. And I really am interested in whether or not the signal, the readiness signal, whether I got an exempt signal or a not exempt signal in English, whether that has an impact on whether or not I apply to and attend a CSU. Now, I can't just compare students who got a exempt signal, a positive signal, from students who got a negative signal, because those students are very different students. They're very different groups of students. First of all, one group is probably more ready than the other, like the test says, but the test is probably correlated with other things like academic achievement, maybe even desire to go to college, some things I can't measure, parental involvement, desire to go to a CSU. So we can't just compare the 2 groups. So we have to get somewhat fancy. So for this graph, this axis is the probability of applying to a CSU. And down here I have EAP English Score, and the 0 is my cutoff. Students over here are exempt, students over here are not exempt. Now this is a hypothetical graph just for illustrative purposes. But you can see, in general, students who scored lower on the EAP were less likely to apply to college than students who scored higher on the EAP. Is this a surprise? No. These students are probably more college ready in the first place. That means they're probably more likely to apply to a CSU. So I can't just compare this group to this group and say, hey, look, there's a big difference. But there is a line right here that as soon as students cross this line, they're told they're ready. But on this side of the line, students are told they're not ready. But this test score only differs by 1 point. Those students are actually the same amount of readiness, have the same amount of readiness, minus 1 point, but they receive very different signals. Students over here are told they're ready. Students over here are told they're not ready, and they're not told, hey, you're only 1 point away. They're just told you're not yet ready for college level work. So if we ignore kind of the overall trend and just focus on this gap right here, this would be kind of an estimate of the effect of getting a signal, a certain signal versus another signal, kind of taking into account the larger overall relationship between college readiness as measured by the test and likelihood of applying for college. We call this regression discontinuity design. And this is, again, totally hypothetical. So let's look at a real one. In a real one, the same pattern, not super surprising. As students are more ready for college, they're more likely to apply to a CSU. And then you get this little downturn up here. And when students score really, really well, they're slightly less likely to apply to a CSU, maybe going to a more selective college, something like that. But what we're really interested in is this gap right here. And for most students, there's absolutely no gap. It's a solid line. For one group of students, students who did not take the math test as well, remember there's a big chunk of students who aren't eligible to take the math test. For the students who only got one signal, and that signal was an English signal, it mattered a little bit. They were 1.5 percentage points less likely to apply to a CSU. But that's just a small subset of students. So what happens about actually attending the CSU? Nothing. Students of all kinds, taking math, doing well in math, not doing well in math, conditional in math, for no one was there an effect of actually attending a CSU. So it might have had a small impact on application to a CSU, but these were likely students that weren't going to attend a CSU in the first place. So we said no effect on enrollment. So English readiness signal has no impact for EAP Math participants. Little one on application, but none on enrollment. Sorry, for math participants, nothing across the board. For math non-participants, a little effect on application, none on enrollment, and there's no impact on enrollment for either group. All right, so the EAP does not reduce the need for remediation by shifting kids away from the CSU. That's a good thing. So might it work through changing their course taking patterns in their senior year? This is a question that was most readily available to analyze in math, because in math, students receive, until a few years ago, math was the only one where they received a conditional score, and their conditional score said, you can become exempt from needing remediation if you take a certain math class and get a C or better. So that's kind of a motivation for students to take that course during their senior year where it might not have been a motivation before. So we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to do a regression discontinuity. This line here represents the not exempt to conditional exempt cutoff, and this line here represents the conditional to exempt cutoff. So you can imagine getting a signal as a student and saying, oh, I should probably take an extra math class when I wouldn't have before. And sure, just as before, the more ready students are according to this test, the more likely they are to take a math course in their senior year, a higher level math course. But we, again, don't see any jumps at the signal, at the signals, suggesting that the signal itself is not responsible for making students take a higher level math class during their senior year. All students may be doing it, but it's not students who are just on the other side of exempt or not exempt. Another study, a lot of studies here. Another study we did was if the EAP has an impact on high school accountability measures. Now how could it possibly have an impact on high school accountability measures? Well, let's talk about it. Until last year, CST, rest in peace, was tied up with the EAP. And students didn't know, students who agreed to take the EAP didn't know which questions funneled into the EAP and which questions didn't. Now prior to this, the CST was a very low stakes test for students. It had virtually no impact on them whatsoever, aside from maybe getting a letter in the mail about not doing well that their parents would read. But it had no impact on their grades, no impact on whether or not they're likely to graduate. But if you include the EAP with it, students are taking a test of college readiness. Now they're perhaps a little more interested in doing better on the CST. So if we're going to look at schools where this optional CST was taken in great amounts by a lot of students, we might actually see increases in their accountability measures, like the number of students who are advanced or proficient on the CST, but also schools' API, which is important. So we're going to divide these groups into schools into 4 groups. So this is all school level data. This was actually done before we had all the individual level data.
I just want to note that this is when before EAP participation rates became nearly universal.
Yeah.
So the only reason we were able to do this is because there was a lag in the adoption of the EAP among schools. And so we're actually taking advantage of that. And some schools quickly hopped on that wagon and others took some time. And that's where we're going to focus on getting those differences.
In the first part of the analysis, we thought, oh, well, there's going to be obvious differences between the schools who signed on en masse and the schools who didn't. And we didn't find a whole lot. Participation in the EAP wasn't correlated with a whole lot. Not saying it was random, but I'm saying it's not like your usual suspects are up here at the top. We divided into 4 groups. These are schools where there was heavy participation. We'll call this quartile 4, quartile 3, quartile 2, and quartile 1 where they had the lowest participation. Some schools where no students participated, all the way up to about 30. So we're going to use a kind of a difference in difference approach here. What I really care about here is comparing the gains in the pre to post EAP era in CST scores for quartile 1, and I want to compare that to the gains from pre to post in quartile 4. So if you think of this difference in quartile 1, everybody got better. That's great. There were more students that were proficient or advanced on the CST in math. Yes, in math. There were more students that were proficient or advanced. But if we kind of use this bar as a ruler, and we go across here, we can say this is what happened when there was basically very little take-up of the EAP. So I'll use a ruler here, about the same, and I'll notice a big difference here if I use this as my ruler, and it would suggest that the gains from pre to post EAP for quartile 4 schools, which are the schools where there was heavy participation, the gains in the percent proficient or advanced was actually significantly greater than quartile 1 schools. We notice the same thing if we just look at advanced. Again, this is the ruler we're using this time, quite a small ruler, not a whole lot of change in advance for those schools. This isn't statistically significantly bigger, but it's bigger. This is, and this is, are both statistically significantly bigger. And then let's look at API. Again, rest in peace. The ruler here, small, but we do see quartile 4. There is a difference in the schools where there is heavy participation by about 5 points. So school characteristics we found were mostly unrelated to take up on the EAP. It was an optional test. Some schools may have pushed it harder than others. Some students may have got interested. Maybe it was a word of mouth thing. It's difficult for us to tell. But when we do see that there is some variation in which schools participated, schools in all levels of participation see gains, which is great. That just means we're not really supposed to compare a CST year to year, but we can compare proficiency levels year to year, and more students were becoming proficient. But we saw higher gains in schools where there was more participation. And there could be many reasons for that. One could be the EAP test. It could be the EAP test itself is making this a little more, providing students with an incentive to do better. But it could be a focus of the schools as well. The schools where there was high participation might have been the schools where they were really pushing college readiness in many dimensions, not just the EAP. It could also be schools where there was a lot of involvement with expository reading and writing. So we're not quite sure yet.
Probably a mix of all.
Probably.